The religious lies of communist snake oil salesmen. Hey, it's Prince of Queens and L. Ron Hubbard, author of the book Dianetics, which is basically the Scientologist Bible, who was also one of the most prolific writers in history, was once quoted as saying, "You don't get rich writing science fiction. If you want to get rich, you start a religion." However, not everybody has the intellectual chops to go ahead and start an entire religion that anybody might be interested in. And so, most of the people who would be interested in doing such things end up becoming a ranking officer in the ranks of some other person's religious organization, hoping to end up getting rich off of that. And many people succeed. Still, if you don't fancy yourself religious, and yet are still interested in using the hopes, dreams, and base assumptions of morality that exist in average citizens as a way to turn a direct personal profit, you can go ahead and sign up with what various people have called the religion of the faithless left. There's a lot of different ways to describe this religion, of course, and I would say that for the most part, it's really just a cultural feeling that is extremely amorphous and usually floats around as a strange pop cultural zeitgeist from various drug scene to various drug scene. Still, the main thing that ends up becoming a consistent dogmatic force is the notion of equality, or rather, equity, which is basically the belief that our government and institutions should ensure that the disadvantaged become the advantaged in some form or another, because that way the world will be fair, and if the world is fair, then nobody needs faith in heaven or an afterlife, I guess. Basically, that ethos is the consistent mentality of the left, and even if somebody says that they are not a communist or a Marxist and yet come from a leftist background like I grew up in, they will almost unanimously believe in these things to some degree or another. I.e., if they don't believe in affirmative action, they'll still probably believe in universal health care if they were raised in Portland, Oregon. Regardless, in my recent studies into the Communist Party of the United States, I have begun to learn that this dogmatic approach to a mentality that ends up certainly sounding a lot like communism can actually be easily traced back to full-blown, self-professed communist and Marxist organizers as far back as early last century. Do you find it rather odd the way seemingly every feminist, black or racial minority activist, and even LGBT organizer seems to also be an intersectional Marxist? Well, I did too, of course, but eventually I actually started looking into the history of what happened early to mid last century in the United States and found out that all of this stuff has a very consistent backbone with the domestic Communist Party of our nation. Now, at this point in the video, there are undoubtedly some viewers that believe themselves to be historians that might be more well-researched than I am, who want me to mention something about the Soviet Union and the KGB during early to mid last century, sending people to infiltrate our institutions in media, education, and government. This is undoubtedly not entirely untrue, but not an area of my study, so I cannot speak to it all that much. However, it is definitely well known and admitted to by radical leftists themselves that the early incarnation of the United States Communist Party was largely composed of Russian immigrants, but certainly not exclusively. You see, there have always been American communists, basically since communism was a thing, and American communists didn't always view things in the same way as the Russians did, and there were regular power struggles among the ranks of the Communist Party in the United States regarding how the leadership should differentiate from that of the Russian Communist Party, and the Russian immigrants fought with the American communists, who were used to a very different culture. That all said, eventually the Communist Party faced severe persecution from the establishment during the McCarthy era, which forced people underground and thus made them cool and edgy in many areas, and then eventually, in the 1960s, communism reemerged carrying a bra that it was ready to set on fire, which we tend to call feminism in the current year. It wasn't quite as simple as that, so stay in tune for future videos about the complications of communism kind of morphing into feminism. But I will say a few things here. For one, the Vietnam War was considered a capitalist venture. People rebelled against that due to the draft that was going on, so it was easy to want to side with the communists if you had friends that were dying in a war that they weren't interested in fighting. For another, like I mentioned about the drugs, LSD came on the scene in the 1960s and gave people the feeling that they were having religious epiphanies when they communed with other hippies and talked about the post-sexist, post-racist utopia that they would all create together once they toppled the capitalist government. Blah, blah, blah. I was listening recently to a long recording of an old, semi-obscure comic book artist named Robert Crumb, where he was talking about the hippie scene in the 1960s and the 1970s in San Francisco. He was friends with people like Janis Joplin, and one of the things he talked about in terms of the hippies was the strange, almost religious attitude they all exhibited after dropping acid, which he found very pretentious. That all said, as somebody who has spent the majority of my life living on the left coast, I can assure you that this pretentious, hippie superiority complex type of attitude has certainly never gone away. I've encountered this attitude more times than I can count, especially when it comes to the types of people who attend the Burning Man festival in the Nevada desert, living mostly on the left coast after the festival is over and they go back home. There's always this attitude among those types of people that they are on to something great and worthwhile, and yet they don't tend to be very good at providing any evidence that they are doing even anything remotely interesting, aside from the occasional piece of sculpture or bit of music that doesn't entirely suck. But of course, there are people among that type of crowd that do consider themselves full-blown activists, or are even politicians in various cities like Berkeley, and we all know what types of politics that these people have. Honestly, at this moment in time, these types of people are literally my least favorite people on the face of the planet, because they are the epitome of everything they claim to stand against, which is ridiculously obvious if you know even the most cursory bits and pieces of information about their personal lives. Many or most of them live in expensive areas up and down the West Coast, often in California. A huge percentage of them are either educators or lawyers who want to get into politics, and the lawyers especially really seem to be universally awful people going along right with that stereotype. You see, one thing that I don't think a lot of people are aware of is that it's extremely difficult to become a lawyer in the state of California. So much so that something like 2/3 of the people who take the bar exam actually end up failing the examination when they first take it. I theorize that this must be because of the ridiculously strange state-specific legal precedent that is in place in California. And I don't say that simply because, duh, it's California, but rather because some of the most intelligent and kind-hearted people I have known failed the exam, and yet I've come across more than one blithering idiot or ideological lunatic that apparently passed the exam on their first try. Furthermore, these types of wacky Marxist lawyers that end up being some of the few people that manage to pass the bar also end up becoming extremely fond of publicity for whatever reason, in the way that they almost always have well over 1,000 friends on Facebook. I've actually been friends with at least one of these people. Truthfully, they give me the creeps when I stop to think about what their lives must really be like. They tend to be unanimously upper middle class, mostly white people who preach the gospel of intersectionality and remind everybody of all of the different historically admired leaders who were Marxists, like Huey Newton or whatever. All the while, they frequently go on lavish vacations, posting pictures of themselves at the pool. These people are lawyers, remember. And regardless of how heinous their work tends to be if you look at it closely and how ridiculously inconsistent the laws are in California, if they are officially certified as a lawyer in the state of California and can push legal documents, then they are of use to politicians, and politicians have every reason to give them money to advance their own agendas. And worse, of course, some of these lawyers end up becoming politicians eventually. Really though, all of this is pretty much just con artistry. You can believe me or not believe me, but the people that I have known that are even vaguely like this, lawyers or not, almost universally don't practice what they preach. The people who blather on and on about intersectionality or feminism or Marxism are almost universally from upper middle class backgrounds and literally get paid to blather on and on about these leftist ideologies as their careers, often making a considerable amount of money and amassing a huge net of power within the city governments wherever they reside. However, do they actually care about people of color or the poor? No, of course not. They tend not to even really know any. Sure, they all have various Marxist activist friends that are racial minorities and also similarly tend to almost unanimously be from upper middle class backgrounds. And sure, they'll occasionally try to join up in solidarity with poor communities that are facing gentrification or whatever. But at the end of the day, these people aren't working class at all, by any means, and they have an elaborate system of language policing and elitist buzzwords and phrases that are constantly changing, which serve basically zero purpose besides gatekeeping regarding which types of people they want to be around. Long story short, these people will make a really big show out of helping poor or minority communities when they think it will look good for their image, but the second they have to actually spend too much time around actual poor people, they'll find a way to call them problematic and then go back to being the champagne socialists that they always kinda really were. Yes, if you've been curious about such things in the past, you've undoubtedly heard the term champagne socialist, which is really what these people are, and to be truthful, people are more than aware that they exist, but they simply aren't all that aware of how they really operate in the current year. These people make for terrible leaders, but they are good at amassing some amount of power fueled by a combination of their own self-righteousness and ability to speak nicely to the unenthused and non-religious masses. If somebody is not a Christian but wants to put faith in something vaguely religious seeming, they often tend to go to these people, trusting that they'll lead them into the intersectional promised land. They'll claim to offer them some sort of post-bigotry and post-pornist utopia, but to be perfectly truthful, the most ironic thing about these people is that the more I think about them and observe their patterns of behavior, the more I start to believe that the vast majority of them must not actually be Marxist true believers themselves. I don't think that they're real Marxists. I think that they're totally capitalists. The reason I feel that way is due in part to the endless death tolls that came from the attempts at communism that we've had in the past, and also simply because religion sells. keyword, sells capitalism. I think that these people at least subconsciously have to know that they're taking everybody for a ride, but simply don't care because they've realized that it's a good way for them to line their pockets. And I think it's kind of sick of them to do that, to be perfectly honest. I just think it's gross. I think it's icky and gross, and it makes me mad. That's all I have to say for this video. If you found it interesting, please do leave me a comment. I have a feeling that if you do that, you'll be given notifications for my videos more often. Thanks.